Welcome to Human Monsters. Part 1. The Man. Kermit Gosnell was born on February 9th, 1941 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His parents were a gas station employee and a government clerk. He graduated from Central High School in 1959. He received his medical degree from Thomas Jefferson University in 1966. Gosnell spent 4 decades of his career providing medical services to the poor. He was involved in a program for teens and opened the Mantua Halfway House, which is a rehab clinic for drug addicts in the Mantua district of West Philadelphia. In the 1960s and 1970s, Gosnell became an advocate for abortion rights. In 1972, he opened an abortion clinic of his own in the Mantua area. As he told the Philadelphia Inquirer that year, "As a physician, I am very concerned about the sanctity of life, but it is for this precise reason that I provide abortions for women who want and need them." This didn't represent the end of Gosnell's abortion-related publicity. Also in 1972, he performed 15 second trimester abortions on television. He employed a technique called supercoil, which was invented by Harvey Karman. This method was controversial for being both experimental and dangerous to the patient. The procedure and its broadcast would become known as the, quote, Mother's Day Massacre of 1972, end quote. The supercoil consisted of an untested plastic ball whose utility was extended through the use of razor blades. It was inserted into the uterus and was then used to chop the fetus into pieces, whereupon it would be expelled. The supercoil often caused complications, among them severe lacerations, infection, and varied degrees of bleeding. 9 of the women who received abortions on the Mother's Day Massacre of 1972 experienced such complications, with 3 of them suffering them to a life-threatening degree. 1 woman was forced to undergo a hysterectomy. 2011. Dr. Gosnell was well known as a physician in Philadelphia. He provided abortions to women of color and immigrant women. He was accused of racism because he segregated the white women from the black women in the way of providing a cleaner facility for the Caucasians. Not connected to racism, but he was alleged to have charged between $1,600 and $3,000 for late-term abortions. He made in the neighborhood of $10,000 to $15,000 a day from the clinic. He also owned clinics in Delaware and Louisiana. Many complaints have been made about Dr. Gosnell over the years. Among them, 1989 and 1993, cited by Pennsylvania Department of Health for having no nurses in the recovery room. 1996, censured and fined in Pennsylvania and New York for employing unlicensed personnel. 2000, a civil lawsuit was filed on behalf of the children of Samika Shah, who called the clinic the day after her abortion was performed to report profuse bleeding. She died 3 days later of a perforated uterus and an infection in her blood. According to the lawsuit, Gosnell failed to direct her to seek emergency care or a follow-up at the clinic. It was settled out of court for $900,000. 2001. Gosnell was suspended for failing to provide appropriate storage conditions for vaccines. 2006. A civil lawsuit was filed by a former patient, though it was dismissed for having been submitted out of time. The patient alleged that Gosnell was unable to complete her abortion, but was then either unable or unwilling to contact paramedics when she was very much in need of assistance. As she put it, "I really felt like he was going to let me die." This only scratches the surface of his transgressions. Part 2. The Investigation. 2009. Figures in law enforcement had become aware that a prescription drug mill was operating at full tilt in Philadelphia. Dr. Kermit Gosnell was accused of writing prescriptions for painkillers for so-called Smurf patients. In other words, they were for fake personages. Medications like Oxycontin were hot on the streets amid the rising fentanyl epidemic. Still, detectives had not yet been able to obtain warrants for the doctor's arrest due to insufficient evidence. The Philadelphia District Attorney's Office collaborated with a federal task force to fight the latest embodiment of the failing war on drugs, that being the effort to shut down the market for prescription painkillers. Oxycodone was the most popular of all. Having taken oxycodone for pain myself due to varicose veins, I can personally vouch for its effectiveness. I also learned how seductive it could be for someone undergoing the risk of using it recreationally, which I do not endorse. Like all addictive drugs, a small dosage will do you at first, but eventually that dose is no longer adequate. Sure enough, 2 was enough for me at first. Eventually I had to take 4. At most, I took 6. That's when I got a look firsthand at how the abuse of such a substance can get out of hand. I have an unfilled refill for Oxy with my pharmacy, but I have chosen not to fill it for that reason. On the streets of Philadelphia, many users of oxycodone had taken to mixing it with codeine cough syrup. The results of this potent recipe were a narcotic whose effects were not entirely dissimilar to heroin. The drug dealers wasted no time in exploiting the trend. They were selling each tablet for $80. The most common sources of oxycodone were drug dealers and corrupt doctors. Investigators were burning the midnight oil, doing all they could to convince detainees to flip and become informants. By doing that, they could narrow down the sources of the drugs. It was like ridding an apartment of cockroaches. You look for the nest. One way Detective Jim Wood would accomplish this was to bust a user for a minor offense, some kind of misdemeanor, like a violation of parking laws. He would then employ the Reed technique, which is a method of interrogation used by many law enforcement officials, which consists of claiming to the detainee that they have prior knowledge of a certain kind of offense that they accuse them of having committed. If the detainee isn't on to the officer's maneuver, they may confess to a crime of which the officer hadn't seen evidence. The Reed technique was often employed amid the efforts to clean the streets of prescription painkillers. The method was effective, and many dealers informed on their associates in the prescription painkiller market. Sometimes conversations between Jim Wood and informants were recorded. The following is a conversation he had with an informant who would be known by a pseudonym, this time as Tanya. This dialogue was recorded on May 12, 2009. Wood: "Yo, Tanya." Tanya: "Yeah, I'm listening." "Everything cool?" "No, not now." Tomorrow I'll get another 120. I'll call you then. You be on standby. Or in the morning, text you or something. Well, can you talk? Because I wanted to talk about the other thing that we were going to do. When do you want to do it? That's what I'm saying. My question to you is, how do I know when I go in there I'll definitely get it? I don't want to waste my 135 or 145 going in there if, you know what I mean. Is it definite or right? I don't want to go there and get bullshit Vicodin. I'm there for oxys. Who are you taking me to so I know? You're talking about what doctor? Yeah. I'm talking about Gosnell. Who? Dr. Gosnell. Dr. Darnell? God. Gosnell. Gosnell. When do you think we can do that? When do you want to go? The Smurfs had been buying prescriptions from doctors by the dozen. Tanya was a Smurf. Tanya told James Wood he would not be able to get an appointment to see Dr. Gosnell to get a prescription. The doctor's accessibility was limited outside of abortions. During the investigation, Tanya wound up going to prison, so other users and dealers were brought in to become informants. During the investigation of Gosnell, his receptionist, Latasha Lewis, was questioned. She identified his patients by placing them into 3 categories: seekers, drug dealers and users; procedures, women seeking abortions; and the sick. This system enabled drug dealers to collect multiple prescriptions on the same day for Urset's patients. An informant for the police managed to get in to see Gosnell. He issued 5 prescriptions: OxyContin, Xanax, Phenergen with codeine, Bactrim DS, which is an antibiotic, Lexapro, an antidepressant. Gosnell had sold Tanya prescriptions under 26 different patient names. On an average evening, he would sell about 200 scripts. He would prescribe all the aforementioned medications, plus Percocet for anybody who had the means and the wherewithal to seek them. Refills were often filled out by Gosnell's staff over the phone. As Latasha discussed details of Gosnell's operation with the investigators, more repugnant aspects of his medical practice began to emerge. She mentioned the unlicensed employees treating patients. She said that decomposing medical waste was left to fester, which often made staff ill. Much of the equipment he used was old and in disrepair. At one point, Latasha mentioned a patient by the name of Karnamaya Mongar, who died in the clinic the previous November. Her death, quote, just wasn't right. Deaths and complications are both risk factors during abortion procedures, but there was apparently something different about this circumstance. When investigators looked into her death, they found that she had a high concentration of the painkiller Demerol in her system, but the cause of death was ruled as accidental. FBI agents and other investigators managed to get search warrants for Gosnell's clinic in Philadelphia. Jim Wood described how things went down once Gosnell arrived. He pulls up. I approached him with my supervisor and Steve Dougherty. He's on the phone with his wife, and he's sort of telling her real quick. I didn't realize he was on the phone at the time. He's telling her the police are here. Gosnell said to Wood that he was under the impression the officers were investigating a shooting at a bar that was situated nearby. To quote Wood, I said, "Doc, get off the phone. I want to explain." I tell him we have a warrant for his office. And he was cooperative. He was typical Gosnell, like this. How do you describe this? Like a calm Hannibal Lecter type mentality? Like, what's all this about? Not only was Gosnell not rattled, but he asked if he could bring his dinner in with him. The police had been briefed about the conditions of the clinic, but nothing could have prepared them for the sensory onslaught that confronted them as they entered the premises. A stench consisting of cat feces, formaldehyde, and human urine punched their faces. To quote FBI Special Agent Huff, there was a cat running around the clinic, and I actually saw urine on the stairs going up to the second floor. There were places where you could see blood on the floor. There were piles of trash all over the place. The smell was very bad. Members of the search team used such adjectives to describe the clinic as filthy, deplorable, disgusting, very unsanitary, very outdated, horrendous, and by far the worst experience they ever encountered in such a setting. All surfaces were blanketed in cat hair, chairs, blankets, everything. Semi-conscious women were observed moaning in the waiting room. The 2 surgical procedure rooms were visibly dirty and unsanitary. One DEA agent would go on to compare the conditions to a, quote, bad gas station restroom. Yes, apparently even Texaco could have provided better abortion facilities. Equipment was dirty and rusty. Women recovering from abortion procedures would do so on dirty recliners and covered with blood-stained blankets. Employees said they tried to have the blankets cleaned every week, but somehow this fell through. Unlicensed employees sedated the patients before Gosnell arrived. They could not say for certain which medications they administered or in what dosages. Many of the medications found on the premises had been stored beyond their expiration dates. The pre-op and post-op areas were a shared space, which is unusual. Typically, half those patients get some privacy. As one official put it, there was no separation anywhere. All the females were sitting in chairs in rows. There was no curtains, no drapes, nothing for privacy, confidentiality, or anything. Various equipment of compromised utility was caked in dust. Every woman in Pennsylvania was supposed to be given 24 hours to seek counseling before undergoing the procedure as a form of sober second thought. Gosnell had them sign the form the day of the scheduled procedure, and there were stacks of them in the office. He was impatient to get his hands on the money. The procedure room was in even worse condition than the recovery room. All instruments were supposed to have been sealed until such time as they were to be used. Only then is the sterilization seal broken. Gosnell followed no such protocols. In fact, all the instruments were unsanitary and placed patients at risk of infection. The suction machine used for withdrawing baby parts was in disrepair. Some of the patients present during the raid were ailing, and paramedics were called. The emergency door that would have been used to bring them outdoors to the ambulance was padlocked. The medics were left no choice but to take the women out the front door. The problem was, the hallways were narrow, awkward, and cluttered with various objects. The medics were left with no alternative than to walk the patients out. Health Department nurse Darlene Augustine accompanied police to the basement. The stairs were rickety and treacherous. They struggled to find a light switch. When the light came on in the basement, they were shocked by what it revealed. Bags of baby parts were stacked in a pile that reached up to the ceiling. Behind the bags of fetal remains were files and more equipment that was broken and or obsolete. The floor was covered in cat feces. There were expired medicines and biological materials that were not being stored in an appropriate manner, i.e., temperature controlled. What enabled Gosnell to continue to perform abortions in such an unqualified facility was the handiwork of one local government official. Whether she was corrupt or clueless remained to be seen. In fact, another abortion was performed during the law enforcement's raid on the building. Immediately after the raid, Gosnell joined the officers for the rest of the questioning. As Jim Wood described it, he comes back with torn surgical gloves, his hands covered in blood, and proceeds to eat teriyaki salmon with chopsticks in front of us. Huff was present and he gave his version on trial. When Gosnell came back, we continued the interview. He actually was still wearing his bloody latex gloves that had some holes in them, and he actually ate his dinner with the gloves on. The DA said, "He didn't take the gloves off?" "No." "Were the gloves whole or were they ripped too?" "Yeah, they had some rips in them. They had blood on them." According to Huff, Gosnell's cat walked into the room after smelling the food. Using a chopstick as a pointer, Gosnell indicated the cat and said, "See that cat? He's killed 200 mice in this clinic." Gosnell dropped the chopstick on the dirty floor. He picked it back up and went back to eating. Huff cannot eat salmon teriyaki to this day. According to Gosnell's staff, he would eat during procedures. To quote one worker, Dr. Gosnell would always eat during a procedure, a sandwich or a bowl of cereal. The door to the operating room would remain open during the procedure, and one of his 2 ailing cats could and did wander in and out. He insisted that he wore the bloodied surgical gloves while eating because he had washed them after surgery and was confident they were hygienic. He claimed to have another reason for wearing the gloves during questioning. "While being questioned, I used non-sterile gloves as I was cleaning a special terrarium as an entry for that year's Flower Show of the Year in the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society." Gosnell was asked who sedated Karnamaya Mongar and about the allegations regarding the prescription drugs. As far as Mongar went, Gosnell asked a woman named Linda Williams, an 8th grade graduate with a phlebotomy certificate, to administer the sedative. He injected her with a second dose. He claimed to have always been present when Mongar received medication. Williams told investigators, when interviewed alone, that she injected the sedative. Gosnell wasn't even in the building. She called him, and all he said in response was, "Met her up." Williams told the detectives Gosnell frequently falsified ultrasound records to adjust fetal ages. His objective was to make the fetuses look younger. She claimed he didn't charge for that service. She said patients would cry and beg him to do so. The truth was, he was performing many late-term abortions, and this was his way of covering it up. In Pennsylvania, A woman could not get an abortion after 23 weeks and 6 days. Gosnell was of good cheer during most of the questioning, but at one point, Wood asked him about the ultrasounds. Wood described Gosnell's reaction. His face changed color, turned like an ashy color. His lips started to quiver, and he dropped his head. And it looked like he was trying to compose himself because he wasn't expecting that. I think that's when he figured out that we were getting information from the other workers, and now he's in big doo-doo. Gosnell claimed he wasn't rattled because he was guilty. He insisted that the business with the ultrasounds was due to him having overlooked those details, leading to penalties. He claimed that most of the fetuses found in the basement might have been late-term abortions. Wood searched areas of the clinic he hadn't explored yet. In a room with metallic cabinets, he opened a pair of cupboard doors to reveal a shelf bearing 5 jars containing the feet of infants. He searched in other areas of the facility. There were other receptacles filled with baby parts. They weren't just kept in medical storage containers either. Water bottles, milk jugs, food containers, cat food packages. If it could contain fetal remains, it would be utilized for that purpose. Combined, the remains of 47 babies were found. Philadelphia's chief medical examiner, Dr. Sam Galino, submitted a report on all the receptacles to the court. There were a great variety of the types of containers. Some of them were, in one case, a distilled water jug where the top had been cut off of it. Others were drink containers, like I think one was a cherry limeade container that had been used. There were others that I recognized. It was a container that you would have either cat or dog food in, because I had actually used that brand of cat food with my cat. So I knew what the container was by its very distinctive shape. And in most of the cases, the tops had been cut off so that the opening was larger. And then they contained in them, usually, some amount of bloody liquid that was frozen, fetal tissue, and then, as I said, some of them also contained other objects, such as gloves or gauze, or, in some cases, some of the cervical dilators. Adding to the documentation, Wood said, "We knew there were fetuses in the freezer during the search, but we still didn't know the extent of all the other information. We didn't know as far as the legitimacy of all the stuff that these workers were saying about Gosnell. For the time being, Gosnell was safe. He hadn't been charged with a crime, and the law enforcement agents weren't authorized to remove any materials from his clinic, so Gosnell was free to continue performing abortions in a filthy building with unsterilized instruments." Wood and another detective investigated Gosnell's Delaware clinic in Wilmington. Wood described a surprise Gosnell unveiled to him. I'll never forget it. You open up the freezer door, and you know how you have one side of a refrigerator is the freezer? Well, Mrs. Mongar's baby was there, in a clear bag. It was the only one in a clear bag, wrapped in a paper towel. The baby was 19 weeks old. The 47 fetuses in the other office were delivered to the medical examiner's office. The jars containing baby feet were not taken there. According to an employee, Gosnell kept the feet for DNA purposes, whatever that meant. No DNA test was ever requested of the clinic. His real reason for keeping the feet was never ascertained. According to some, Gosnell severed the baby's feet for his own amusement and disposed of them at his leisure. A detective removed Gosnell's medical license from his office wall. There were blood droplets on it. There was a clean spot behind where it had resided, more evidence of what a pigsty the clinic was. The toilets and the washrooms didn't work, so the patients often resorted to urinating on the wall. The toilets had been used to flush fetal remains and had become backed up in the process. Apparently, a plumber had not visited the premises in years, despite all the money the clinic was making. The drug addicts who paid Gosnell for scripts often vomited on the floors of the washrooms. February 22nd, Dr. Gosnell's license to practice medicine was temporarily suspended. Some of Gosnell's staff opened up about why he cut many of the babies' necks. He would often finish the babies off with scissors. To quote a prosecutor, "I had girls who were saying that that's how he accomplished the demise. A lot of them had these marks in the back of the neck. We couldn't tell that they were perfect scissor marks. Not all the cuts were clean and precise. Some of them were torn. As a prosecutor put it, that was gruesome. That was when it was like, this is disturbing." Gosnell was slapped with 5 charges for abuse of a corpse, for severing feet and other mutilations to the bodies of the fetuses. As the law states it, it is a crime for a person to treat a corpse in a way that he knows would outrage ordinary family sensibilities. One former patient of Gosnell's, Desiree Hawkins, recalled that Gosnell did not handle her procedure gently. As she put it, "I remember I kept coming to because I kept feeling pinching. It wasn't cutting because there were no marks there later, but I kept feeling pinching and pulling, which is the reason why I felt I kept waking up. Every time I wake up, I feel it." The last time she woke from the procedure, she saw Gosnell engaged in some activity. To quote Hawkins, "I just remember him picking up something and walking out of the room. To this day, I don't know if that what he picked up was my baby or not. I don't know. I think I've convinced myself that's what it is, but I don't know." Speaking of her discovery that Gosnell kept one of her baby's feet as a trophy, she said, "It gets worse because the one picture of the specimens they showed online, the very last one where part of the label is showing, that's mine. You don't even know how to respond when you find that a human or somebody else has kept the foot of your baby. You don't know how to answer that. You just want to cry. You just want to get sick. You don't want to believe it, and I still don't." One fetus, whose gender is unknown, was discovered in a plastic bleach bottle. It was swaddled in a red biohazard bag. Both its feet had been severed. The feet of a 22-week-old fetus were kept in separate jars labeled with the same name and date. The left foot of another fetus was found in another jar. As revealed in court, Gosnell would sever the spinal cords of still living babies and put their bodies in, quote, "cut off milk jugs, water containers, and juice cartons." The 28-week-old fetus came to become known as Baby Boy B was discovered inside a plastic water container. The placenta and several gauze pads were also found inside. The medical examiner commented on all this in court. Certainly things like drink containers, milk containers, water containers. This is not something we do in medical practice. What I do does not deal with living patients, and I would not put something in a plastic drink container. It feels wrong, I guess is what I'm saying. It feels wrong. During the grand jury trial, a woman representing the National Abortion Federation described Gosnell's facility as the worst she had ever visited. She rejected his application for accreditation. One patient nearly died of an infection because Gosnell left a part of the fetus inside her, which decomposed. Another patient was butchered by Gosnell to an even greater extent. He left most of the fetus inside her. He tore her cervix, uterus, and bowel. She had to undergo emergency surgery to remove 5 inches of her bowel. She also needed a blood transfusion. She had no medical insurance, so on top of all the health complications she suffered, she was given a bill for $20,000 for what she had endured. On at least 4 occasions, clinic staff witnessed Gosnell perform abortions on underage girls who were brought into the clinic against their will by their mothers. Former staffer Marcella Chuang submitted the following complaints about Gosnell's practice. There are 2 cats walking around in this medical office. They are allowed in procedure abortion rooms. They vomit up and down the steps. On procedure days, they reuse curettes, but they are disposable. They never get thrown in trash. There are dried up blood stains in the chairs in the recovery rooms. The doctor will eat in procedure rooms while patients is in there. There are 2 males in the room while procedures are taking place. Many of the patients complain, but nothing is done. The patients are knocked out of medicine. They pay for twilight and custom anesthetic, but only get heavy. They, patients, are unaware of this. In one of the charts, a patient used her cousin's insurance to get the procedure done, and they wrote this in the chart. There are minors who don't want the procedure done, and they say it, but the doctor does it anyway. The doctor does second tries on Tuesday nights and does not report it to the IRS. He, the doctor, pockets the money. On Mondays, the office is open to 11 p.m. The doctor will write notes for patients he hasn't seen in 3 months. He also writes a lot of Percocet prescriptions, 90 for the same people, like every Monday night. How much pain are they in to use 90 Percocets in a week? The doctor's pediatric room, where they get weighed, is where the cat's litter box is. The doctor will do their patients' procedures right after they've been counseled, supposed to be 24 hours after. The person who cleans doesn't take the whole trash bag. He takes what's in the trash bag. Nasty. If a patient vomits, it's in the trash the next day. All in all, this is a nasty facility. When he first got the cats, he had to treat his staff for fleas. Check Shala or Tanya Butler's chart. It's probably been cleaned up. She signed 3 different names. Please keep my name confidential. You can ask anyone working there about this complaint, except Jonathan. He is Dr. Gosnell's right hand. I think he should lose his license because he should know better. The things that are going on in this medical office is nasty and could be spreading diseases. In one report, it was noted that Gosnell stored aborted fetuses in the same refrigerator where employees kept their lunches. When one patient asked Gosnell what he did with the fetuses after the procedures, he said, "We burned them." In all, Gosnell faced 258 charges. 7 counts of first-degree murder for snapping the necks of 7 babies. The third-degree murder of Karna Maya Mongar. Conspiracy to commit murder in the hundreds of unidentifiable instances of killing living babies. 2 counts of infanticide due to failure to resuscitate babies born alive that could have survived. Several violations of the Abortion Control Act and Controlled Substance Act. Obstruction of apprehension. Perjury. Evidence tampering. Racketeering. Theft as a result of deception. Corrupting the morals of a minor for employing Ashley Baldwin, a teenager. Gosnell was calm as he was led in handcuffs to the police cruiser during his arrest. He said with a smirk, "So, this is what happens when you try to help people." The smirk dropped when he was informed by a judge that he would not make bail because it was a capital murder case. Gosnell's unqualified medical staff described what it was like disposing of infants in a barbaric fashion. In Sherry West's testimony, she detailed the delivery of a child that came to become known in the office as, quote, "the crying baby." She said, "I can't describe it. It sounded like a little alien." She said it was between 18 and 24 inches long, making it one of the largest babies born alive in the clinic. West went on to say, "It wasn't fully developed. It didn't have eyes or a mouth. But it was like screeching, making this noise. It was weird. It really freaked me out. And I said, 'Call Dr. Gosnell,' and I went back out front." She described the murder of a child who came to be known as Baby D. It was born in the toilet. This child struggled and moved its arms as West killed it. To quote West, "The baby precipitated into the toilet. I took it out of the toilet and put it into a bowl, and I used surgical scissors to cut the back of the baby's neck, just like Dr. Gosnell showed me to do. Before I cut the neck, I saw the baby's arms moving. This was when I took it from the toilet and put it in the bowl, and then I went to put it in a milk jug to take it upstairs. Before I put it in the milk jug, I saw the arms moving, and that's when I cut the back of the neck." Liz Hampton reflected on her time working for Kermit Gosnell years after leaving the clinic. "I was brought up not to hate, but I hate him. I hate him for what he did to other people. I hate him for ruining so many women's lives. I hate him for ruining my life. It's very hard for me to get a job. People have offered me jobs, but under the table. I won't take it. It's against the law." Like Kermit Gosnell, Liz Hampton and his other staff continue to face consequences for his malpractice. Unlike the many babies who were killed there, the prosecution lives on. While one can point to Kermit Gosnell as an example of how not to operate an abortion clinic, I would like to shed light on a doctor who did it right. Dr. Henry Morgentaler operated abortion clinics in Canada for decades, from the days before legalization. He was threatened by pro-life protesters, had a clinic bombed by them, and endured prison time. There's a 6 degrees of separation factor at work here because my uncle, who was a provincial court judge in Nova Scotia, presided over one of Morgentaler's hearings. Morgentaler would not back down because he believed that women had a right to terminate a pregnancy if it was not in their best interests, and also if it was not in the best interests of the child. This is an interview he did with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
We believe that any woman should have the right to ask for a termination of pregnancy within the first 3 months of pregnancy, because we believe that she alone should make the responsible decision whether she wants this pregnancy to continue or not.
Henry Morgentaler emerged as a public advocate for abortion in October of 1967 when he testified before a government committee. Born in 1923 in Poland, the young Montreal doctor survived the Holocaust, spending time inside the concentration camps Auschwitz and Dachau. In other words, Henry Morgentaler was used to a fight, and in 1969 he got one when he began performing what would end up being thousands of illegal abortions. Do you remember the first abortion that you performed when you decided to essentially cross the Rubicon?
Well, it was an 18-year-old girl who was brought to me by her mother. Everything went well. We had a good result, and she was happy, the mother was happy, I was happy. So,
did you know in doing it that you were about to embark on something that would change your life?
I think that I knew that if I started doing abortions on a bigger scale, that eventually I'd have to face the criminal code and prosecution and things like that. But I was convinced in my mind that if I came before a jury and I explained my motivations, that I would be acquitted, and this is exactly what happened.
Morgentaler spent much of the 1970s fighting a series of criminal charges, and although he was never convicted by a jury, he did spend time in a Quebec prison after a court of appeal overturned a not guilty verdict. In the 1980s, he took his fight to the rest of Canada, mostly Ontario. And in 1983, he was charged in Ontario for procuring illegal miscarriages. That case ended up at the Supreme Court and resulted in the now famous decision, Morgentaler versus the Queen. But now, at the age of 84, with his third wife, Arlene, beside him, Henry Morgentaler invited us into his home to speak candidly about the personal events that motivated his long struggle, from his life during World War II to the serious stroke he suffered from last year. How close were you to death, Henry?
Quite close. I survived that, and I survived also an operation on my heart. So I'm sort of a newborn baby now, if you could say that. And I enjoy being alive.
Did you ever struggle philosophically with the abortion question? I mean, what would give us your...
Sure. I struggled with all this. I'm a thinking person. I came to the conclusion that here was a law and a practice which was based on the wrong assumptions, mostly religious, and that it was time for somebody, and that was me, to raise this issue so that women would be protected against all the hazards of bad abortion, self-induced abortion, injury as a result of that.
But even though Henry Morgentaler won all these arguments in the Supreme Court, the battle on the ground has raged on. In 1992, his clinic in Toronto was bombed, and he and thousands of women who use his clinics have been subjected to years of threats and verbal abuse. And even today, access to abortion is far from guaranteed. The procedure is still not available in every province, and it remains expensive. Women in rural and northern communities have to travel hundreds of miles or more in order to obtain the procedure. For Morgentaler, the fight goes on. What was the most frightening time for you?
You knew that any time somebody could just fire a bullet into me, and that was it, you know.
Henry, you're not the boss? You're not the boss? You're not the boss? Huh? You see? You're not the boss?
So whenever I went to the clinic and there were protesters, and they were not the kindest people in the world, you know, they're shouting slogans and vilifying me and threatening me. Well, it took me a while and a few minutes, at least 15 minutes, to calm down and be able to do my work, because it had an effect.
Were you prepared to be killed for this
Yeah,
cause?
well, I was prepared, but I hoped it wouldn't happen. But I was prepared. I knew I was in a kind of dangerous profession. I knew that doctors were being shot. I knew that I was a target. And I was determined to be able to continue in spite of all that.
Morgentaler often says that his life has been given in the service of women. And in a new documentary called Henry, he explores that question in a very personal way, revealing his complicated series of marriages and affairs and the cost they had on his life. What do you think explains this, your relationships to women, the 3 marriages and sometimes a wife and sometimes another person?
Well, what explains it is my inordinate need to be loved by women. And sometime along my emotional development, I got the impression that my mother didn't love me because there was a younger baby that she devoted a lot of attention to, which happens in many families, I guess. I personally believed that she neglected me and she didn't love me. So to be loved by women was emotionally to me very important.
Many people described you as a womanizer. Do you think that's fair?
Well, I think it's reasonably fair, yes. I like women, and there's no reason why I should apologize for that.
Do you think that you had one of the drivers for your life was an ego, a need to be the center of attention?
Yeah, probably yes. Being the center of attention validates you. It means I'm important. I do important things. I can be recognized for that. And yeah, that was like a leitmotif in most of my life.
Egoist, crusader, hero. 20 years after the Supreme Court decision that changed so many lives, Henry Morgentaler remains one of the most controversial and complicated figures in Canadian history.
Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.